Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see all of you here in the audience, and I know we have a group on the live stream as well. I'm Carolyn Waters, the director and head librarian here at the New York Society Library. And if you are new to the New York Society Library, I just want to let you know that we have lots of wonderful events like tonight's event on our slate of programming. So if you're interested, please feel free to talk to a staff member, pick up an events listing downstairs, or just sign up for our newsletter. You can do that on our website. We'd love to have you. I should mention, just let everybody know that we are live streaming and recording tonight's event, as well as taking photographs. I am really pleased to welcome Rose Styron and Jenny Allen to the members room. We're really happy to have Jenny back because she was here after a really very funny performance in Uptown at Night, which I can't believe now was 2018, so long ago. I can't believe it. Yeah. She is the author of Would Everybody Please Stop? Reflections on Life and Other Bad Ideas, and has written for magazines including The New Yorker, New York, Vogue, Esquire, The Huffington Post, and Good Housekeeping. Her work has been included in Andy Borowitz's anthology, The 50 Funniest American Writers, and In the Fullness of Time, 32 Women on Life After 50. Rose Styron is the author of 3 volumes of poetry and numerous articles on human rights and foreign policy. She also edited the selected letters of William Styron. She was a founding member of Amnesty International USA and has chaired PEN's Freedom to Write Committee and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Awards, and has served on the boards of the Academy of American Poets, the Association to Benefit Children, and the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC. About her new memoir, Beyond This Horizon, the Washington Post says, a memoir of an extraordinary life, a life well worth telling and reading about. Copies of Ms. Styron's book are for sale by Sasha, our friend from the corner bookstore right outside. And for those of you on the live stream, the link to purchase the book online is in the chat. Also, we want to make sure to include some question and answer in conversation with the audience at the end, so hold your questions, and we will rotate the mic around the room so that everybody can hear. So please enjoy this conversation with Jenny Allen and Rose Styron.
Hi, Rose. Rose and I, this is our 3rd time doing this, so I have to think of different questions to ask her every time. We love doing it. We'll come to your home. We're ready to hire ourselves out, right, Rose?
Right.
Susanna, who's Rose's oldest, I was speaking to her last year or something, and I said, you know, what do you think just kind of sums up your mother? I mean, what is it? What motivates her? What propels her? And she said, she had obviously thought about this since we're about the same age. She said, she doesn't want to miss anything.
I don't what?
She said, my mother doesn't want to miss anything. And that really is, I think, the best way of kind of summing you up. That is, you wake up every day and you don't want to miss a movie, a lecture, a trip, breakfast with a friend, a movie, Lawrence O'Donnell every night, MSNBC if you're in front of a TV, if you happen to be near a TV. And I just wanted to, do have a question, but I have to, as one example of this incredible appetite you have for life and your curiosity and energy. I don't know if you all remember the Women's March in Washington in 2017, and I have one friend who was with Rose and traveled down with us to go to it. Polly is here. And on the way back, Rose and I aspired to drive from Washington, D.C. to Woods Hole back to Martha's Vineyard in one day, which is like a 10-hour trip. And that was enough activity for me for that day. And as Rose and I passed, I don't think you remember this, we never talked about it. We drove out of Washington and soon we came to Baltimore. But we had like 8 hours and 40 minutes ahead of us. And Rose said, oh, let's stop at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And because that's where she used to go as a little girl and had been many times since. Can't we just stop there? I said, Rose, no, we have to get to Woods Hole. If we miss the ferry, that's it for us. Well, can't we just stop for a little while? Well, I did prevail upon her not to stop, but that's very Rose.
Well,
So-
that's because they had the whole cone collection.
Little
Oh,
closer.
sorry. That's because the Baltimore Museum of Art had all the French Impressionist collection, the first one, the Cone sisters brought to Baltimore, and they were installed in our wonderful Baltimore Museum of Art, not far from where I lived. So I lived there half the time when I was
when you
a
were
kid.
growing up.
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit more about Baltimore, but I guess my question is this thirst and curiosity and incredible energy has not diminished as you've gotten older, has it?
No, but my hearing and my sight, my legs, they've all diminished.
But it really doesn't seem to stop you from doing that much. I mean, you physically.
Well,
it's
I
a little-
don't really travel much further than New York or Washington.
Or Los Angeles,
Yeah.
or Florida.
Los Angeles.
Yeah, Florida, yeah, a few other places. So it's always been interesting to me that you were kind of born this way. You really are, your parents were sort of careful, somewhat conventional people, would you say?
Oh, extremely conventional. And I was the youngest child by a decade. So my older siblings had gone off to college, and my mother did a lot in Baltimore, and my father went to Washington every day. So I was a very lucky little girl and had people to take care of me, but not supervise me. And so, as I think I told you,
Please tell more.
I was left to my own happy devices, and I used to climb out of my second-story window and shimmy down the sycamore tree and run around the neighborhood to be sure I was back in time to have breakfast with my father before he went off there. And
But this was at like 5, right? Quite young.
yeah,
And you would, as I've heard you talk about it, you would sort of roam around the neighborhood.
I did.
Yeah, just
I
rather
got into lots
fearlessly.
of trouble.
Well, and didn't somebody call you that naughty little Styron girl?
Yes.
Not Styron, that naughty
They
little Burgunder
repeated
girl.
it. This guy repeated it.
Would you tell?
Okay. Well, one morning, and it was just summer mornings when I ran around the neighborhood, about 6 in the morning when it was nice and light. Thank you. And I learned to read when I was 4 because my older siblings taught me. So by the time I was 6, I had read all the Nancy Drew books. So one day at 6:30, I walked down my street and up the next street at 6:30 in the morning, and I saw my mother's best friend, who was married and lived on that street, very tall, beautiful young woman, and a very short man who I knew was a famous scientist who lived a few blocks away, whose children I knew. And they were hand in hand walking up the street. And Nancy Drew said, "Aha, I caught you," having no idea what I was saying. So 60 years later, more than that, almost 70, I was in New York looking in Scully's window because I loved China, and it was a big reflective window. And as I stood there, I heard a voice with a Baltimore accent saying, "There's the naughty little neighborhood girl I told you about." And I could see reflected this little man and another very tall woman, because by now he's well over 90. And I wished I had said to him again, I wished I'd turned and said, "Caught you," but I didn't. I ducked into Scully's and bought some china.
Something you do, you talk about as well with great fondness, and you had said to me, I became myself in Atlantic City. This is on the subject of freedom and adventuring as a girl, and having quite a lot of freedom. But a lot of children would have not done what you did in Atlantic City. If you would just talk about this for a little bit, because that was really important to you, I think, as a place where you felt free and empowered, as they say, and maybe you would tell them.
When I was 5 and 6, and my older siblings would go out west or to Europe with my parents, I was sent to my wonderful little nearsighted old grandmother in Atlantic City, because she had a little hotel apartment there every summer. And in the morning when I got up, she would say, "After breakfast, would you set out all my mahjong tiles for me?" Because she was even more nearsighted than I am now. And I would do that, these wonderful ivory tiles I loved. And then she said, "Here's a purse. Go have a good time on the boardwalk, dear, and come back in time for lunch." So I would, I was in love with the 16-year-old elevator operator, Dick McCormick, and I would go down. He'd drop me off all the way downstairs, and I would go out on the beach, but I knew I was not allowed to swim. I was told that by my grandmother. So I would turn around and go up the steps to the boardwalk and have a fabulous, fabulous day on the boardwalk, doing all kinds of wonderful things on the steel pier and the million.
Is that where the women jumped off and dove off?
Yeah, that's where, right. I would go down at the bottom and scare myself, with all the fish that would come out at me anyway. And then I'd go up to the top and watch beautiful young women click their heels on lovely steeds and dive way down into the water.
Yeah, on horses. They were on horses, that's right.
I did that every day. And then I would play skee ball, and then I would go to the $1 Million Pier and watch women in beautiful clothes dancing. And
Heaven.
I'd go, yeah.
Heaven. And just kind of fearlessly.
It was terrific. And I always I climbed up on, I won't go into all of it, I could tell you all. And then I'd go back for lunch, and my grandmother would give me another little purse. They were sort of gold.
Great.
And said, "Go have a good time on the boardwalk, dear, and come back in time for tea." And one day she said to me, "Oh, Shirley Temple film is here. Baby, take a bow." You can tell how long ago that was. And she said, "You can go to that." And she gave me money to go. I didn't want to see Shirley Temple. She was the same age I was, and I was bored to death with her. So I went to see Claudette Colbert in It Happened One Night. And I had a good time.
Oh, right. A maverick, then as now. I just loved those stories about Atlantic City.
But I never saw another child on the boardwalk, because nobody would have allowed their child
to roam
out
around
at 5
like
and
that.
6 years old.
It's amazing. And also, you took advantage of it in a great, great way. Now, since we're in a library, I thought we should at least make a pass at mentioning some of the books, your girlhood books, that I think you were born adventurous, but these books certainly sound like they made an impact on you. Not only Nancy Drew, but there were these others that I was reading about
That you
wrote
probably
about.
never heard of.
Well, I hadn't heard of the Beverly Gray 28 books, The Mysteries About a Girl Reporter, but you wrote about her in your memoirs being exciting. Susanna of the Yukon, a Canadian series, or it was called They were all called different things. Susanna of the Mounties, Susanna of the Yukon. These were all, and Nancy Drew, of course. And didn't you read all the Hardy Boys books?
I read all the Hardy Boy books. I read all the books about little girls and boys going to foreign places. Then I said I wanted to see one day. So
And your father
maybe
brought
that
you,
was
didn't he bring you
embedded.
these books? It was embedded in you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Didn't he bring you these books from the department store, from your
He
family
did.
department store,
Yeah.
Cons?
My father was part of a department store in Washington, D.C., which doesn't exist anymore. But he would bring me every Monday one of the Nancy Drew books from their book department and say, wash your hands, make sure you don't get the book dirty because I have to take it back to the bookstore on Friday.
That was a
So that
thrifty generation.
And then, of course, by the time I was 12 and 13, I was working in that bookstore. I used to go over with my father on the B&O Railroad every day
in
to
the
Washington.
department store, right?
And then one day, when I was 13, my father knew people at the Washington Post, and because I had been to art school from age 9 to 12 at the Maryland Institute and loved fashion, they hired me to do their fashion ads, and I had the most fabulous
fun.
13-year-old time
So fun.
in Washington.
So fun. Well, skipping ahead a little bit after your 13-year-old adventure, you, after you went to Wellesley, you got a graduate degree from Johns Hopkins in poetry or was it called creative writing or was
Creative
it
writing,
creative writing?
all
But you were a
kinds.
poet.
A lot of it was political, and the rest was poetry.
Like most women of your generation, you got married and had children, started having children.
That's right.
And led a rather domestic life for quite a while as a mother and support of your husband. And you write in your book, I'd been taught by my mother to accommodate my husband's needs and promote him. Her words were in my head, even much later when I didn't always act on them. Now, well, I'll ask you about not always acting on them later, but did you, part of again, your life was quite domestic, and you were your husband's support, and you typed his manuscripts for years, and he read out loud to you in the evenings, which sounds pretty great. Did you comment on his work? Did you feel like you were, did you feel like you shouldn't comment on it? Or,
No.
what was your feeling about being the wife of a writer?
Well, I loved hearing the 1 or 2 pages that he would write, and sure, I would comment because he wanted me to. We had discussions at night. I would go to bed. He'd stay up until early morning thinking what he was going to write the next day. And I would type whatever he had written with 2 fingers. I flunked typing. I never got more than 2 fingers. But that was fine for a couple of pages in the morning. But I think the only advice I ever gave him, and he actually took it, was when he had written Sophie's Choice, and he read me the first chapter that he had written, and it was the scene in Sophie where she has to choose between her 2 children when she gets to Auschwitz. And I said, if this is your first chapter, it's beautiful, but there's not a woman in the world who's ever going to read chapter 2. It's just too agonizing
Right.
to have to choose between your children.
Right.
So he saved it, and he made a much better chapter much later. And I think that was the only really effective thing I did.
Yeah, that was pretty effective. That was really effective. Oh, I have to ask you, because I meant to ask earlier, speaking of writers, before you had children, after you were married, you worked at you did some reading for the Paris Review, some reading of,
Yeah, I
those
had
were your
met-
pals. Will you tell this, well, tell about the Philip Roth
Oh,
manuscript?
well, backstory first.
Yes, please.
I met and had a romance with Bill Styron in Rome. He rented a car, and we went to Paris for Christmas so I could meet and he could re-meet his friends from the Paris Review, because he had written stuff for the very first issue of the Paris Review, which hadn't been published yet. It was published later in the year, and of course it's still going strong. So he wanted me to come and meet his friends, Peter Matheson, George Plimpton, Doc Humes, etc.
Marquand? Was Marquand?
John
Yeah.
Marquand, you can remind me of all of them.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, I went.
Irwin
Bill-
Shaw was around then.
What?
Irwin Shaw.
Irwin Shaw was sort of the godfather of the Paris Review at that point. And when Bill and I got back to Rome, we actually split for a few months, but then we got back together and got married. And by this time, Irwin Shaw had rented a top-floor apartment in Rome. And so he kept saying, "Why don't you all get married and I'll give you a party?" And
What a good excuse
we
for
thought that was a
party.
good idea,
Yes,
because the
very
head
good idea.
of, I was living with Bill next door to the Paris, next door to the American Academy in Rome, because I couldn't live there with him. But the head of the Academy didn't like at all that their first novelist fellow was having an
Shacking
affair
up, yeah.
and had rented a basement apartment next door. So we thought, well, okay, let's get married and we'll get Irwin to give us a party, which he did.
Was it a great party, by
It was
the
a
way?
great party.
Oh, great.
It's
Okay.
where we met Lillian Hellman, and she was blacklisted at the time, and we met a lot of people. And he had sent a telegram to the Paris Review saying, "You guys better come to Rose and Bill's marriage. After all, a guy doesn't get married more than 2 or 3 times in his life." So they all came, and we had a great time, and most of them came on our honeymoon in Ravello with us. But we were there for about 9 months. They weren't. They came and
Was
went.
Gore Vidal in Ravello then? Was that, no, he didn't go to,
What?
Was Gore Vidal in Ravello? Gore Vidal.
No, we didn't meet him in Ravello. We stayed in the old British owner's deserted house above Ravello, and Gore Vidal bought it later and made it his home. And we got to know Gore in New York, but we didn't know him
Then.
in Ravello.
So, sorry to, so you worked, so you read manuscripts for the Paris Review.
Yeah, and yes, once we got married, then George Plimpton, who was the editor-in-chief at that point, said, "Well, will you please read for us all the stories that come in over the transom?" That's what it was called in those days, the unsolicited manuscript. So wherever Bill and I went, there were all these piles of manuscripts. Once in Rome, I remember the bottom one was burning because it had been put on a radiator. But for 2 years, I read many, many, many manuscripts. Some by Native Americans because they wanted to do a Native American issue of the Paris Review, etc. And then I got the first 2 stories by Philip Roth, And so I called George and said, I've got two great stories that you have to publish. This was my first enthusiastic response. And Philip kept saying that I discovered him.
Well, you kind of did.
Well,
I mean,
they came in and I read them, so that's
did you
all.
know who Roth was? Did you know who he was before you read them?
No.
Oh, he was just a
He
young
never-
writer.
He never
He
published before.
Right, that's what
But
I was asking,
by a
I
year
guess.
later, he had a story in the Atlantic, and then he wrote Portnoy's Complaint, and he was off to a big career and became our neighbor in Connecticut.
But I always loved that story of you going through the slush pile, because you did do him a big favor by doing that.
I was lucky.
So in this life of domesticity, but literary domesticity, I guess you'd call it, and you were, I asked you once about Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, and you said, I didn't really feel thwarted as a mother with young children. I loved it. It was another adventure for me, which I loved. But you kept writing
Well,
poems.
I wrote for Ms. Magazine and
Yes, you did.
became a friend of Gloria Steinem's, who at that point was, before she got into Ms., she was the girlfriend of a guy I knew.
Of course she was. But I guess what I wanted to point out or ask you to talk about a little bit was I found it very moving that when you were raising your children, you kept writing poetry, but you kept and you did not stop writing, but your poems and you put in a drawer.
Yeah. I was
And-
too busy to do anything about publishing them at that point. Oh, I had published a book of children's
Yes, you
poetry.
children's poetry.
Yeah, but I put my adult stuff in my desk drawers.
Well, would you tell us the story about who went through your drawers and found them? And
Oh, it was a writer named Jerzy Kosinski. I don't know how many of you know who he was. Quite a character. And he was teaching at Yale. And one day I came back after taking the children to school, and there was Jerzy sitting at my desk going through all the drawers. And I said, Jerzy, what are you doing? And he said, well, whose poems are these? And I said, they're mine. And he said, well, I'm going to take them to my girlfriend, Kiki von Fraunhofen, who...
oh, that's just the best name ever, isn't it? Oh, Kiki von Fraunhofen.
I don't know whatever happened to her, but he was living
Yeah.
with her at Yale while he was teaching. And I'm going to get her to type them, and I'm going to send them to my publisher. And I said, sure, type them. I don't have time to. But send them back to me, because I did do a children's book with Viking, and I guess I should show it to them first, and if they don't want it, good luck. But Viking published it and published my next 3 books.
That
So
was
that
called,
nice.
and that book was Thieves' Afternoon, right?
Yeah.
That book of poetry. Yep.
Right.
Did Bill ever comment on your poems? Did you show them to him? Did you talk about them, or did you just was it more hands off?
I hate to tell you that the answer is negative, mostly. Bill was so concentrated for much of our 50 years of marriage on what he was writing, because it was his novelist brain. And I realized he was not going to be interested in my poetry, and I wasn't very interested in it at that moment because I had Bill and his work and the children.
Right.
But I'd been writing since I was a kid, and I'd won a couple of poetry prizes, and so I thought, okay. And I did a book of children's poems, and I just didn't care, so I stuck them in the drawer. And then, because as you know, I got into Amnesty International, and when I did and began traveling for them, I didn't write poetry for another 20 years. So my last couple of books...
It's a different part of the brain than your work for Amnesty, I think. Thank you for giving me a nice opening to talk about Amnesty.
Well, I wish there were a map of the brain. because I can't figure out why poetry is in one section, adventure and human rights journalism, because I became a journalist for that. And now I've written a memoir, which is the past. And I think they're all from separate parts of the brain. Because they don't.
Maybe somebody in the Q&A will illuminate that
Maybe.
for us.
That would be great if anybody
So
can tell me about that.
Your first trip to without Bill and for Amnesty was January 1974, and this began this really long career you had as a human rights activist for Amnesty and also for Penn, and also on behalf of abolishing the death penalty. Just
Yep.
until, I think, are you still on the board of Amnesty, or did you recently resign? Or, I mean, your work went on for 50 years.
They've kept me in their loop. But the last thing they asked, I mean, I don't obviously go to meetings anymore, and Amnesty is, doing lots of other things. But a few months ago, they called and asked me if I would go with friends of mine that you may know from Edgartown, Kathy and Ed Ludwig. Anyway, we all met actually in Ireland through Amnesty, and they are wonderful philanthropists and luckily have lots of money,
That's nice.
and he recites poetry, even my poetry, to me sometimes.
Oh, very nice.
Which I've
We
never,
like him.
which I couldn't do. But they asked if I would go with them down to the Texas border and try to help the children who were having such a terrible time, being separated from their parents and put in, dire circumstances. And I said, well, of course I'd go, because I'd been on other trips like this to Florida with kids who had come from China and were in trouble. And then at the last minute, they called back and said, don't go, and we don't want you to go with the Ludwigs, because the people on the border, this is Trump time, of course,
Yes.
know how much money the Ludwigs have, and you'll be kidnapped. So we didn't go. So I haven't done anything for Amnesty for a long time, but I'm still in touch with them all the time.
Did you feel like when you took that trip to, I wonder if you could just briefly tell us about, because for those who haven't read the book, it's a wonderful story, this first trip to Santiago when Pinochet has taken over. And there was the wonderful cloak and dagger quality to that trip.
Well, I guess
maybe would you mind
you
telling
mainly
us?
have to read it in the book because it's so complicated. But I took my 17-year-old daughter, Susanna, with me. And it was a couple months after Pinochet had his terrible coup in Chile, of which this is the 50th anniversary.
This is the 50th anniversary?
Yep. Because it was the end of December of 73 and the January of 74 that I went, and Susanna and I were pretending that we were on mother and daughter on New Year's vacation, which of course nobody in his right mind would have gone to Chile at that time, to this American-backed coup, and which I didn't know it was American-backed at the time. I thought it was just terrible Pinochet. So we had quite an adventure there, and we managed to lie about what we were doing because, and you all might see the film Maestro, which is coming out very soon. Leonard Bernstein's wife, who was a Chilean actress, said, "You're going to have trouble when you go to Chile. I'm going to give you a huge bolt of material that my sister, who's married to someone who supports Pinochet in Chile, she wants it for curtains. And you take this with her, and I will get her husband, my sister's husband, to meet you, to pick you up at the airport, take you to his house, and you'll be much safer because you'll, be associated with him." So we did that briefly, and I won't go into the detail. He left,
Yeah.
and he gave us the number of his travel agency, which was right behind the hotel we were staying in Santiago. And we had quite a time there, escaping and being, I guess you'll have to read the book if
All
you
right,
want
all
to.
right, all right.
because
There's a
it's-
wonderful scene in the pool that starts the book.
But the scene that starts it is where my daughter Susanna and I are in a swimming pool, which is on the outskirts of Santiago as a little resort. And the woman, we couldn't find the first 3 or 4 people we wanted to see. But then the woman who was married to a religious leader liked Susanna and me and said, "I know how to help you. You go to this swimming pool and throw a red ball around, and the wives of all of Allende's ministers who are in political prisons all over Chile and in Antarctica, they will give you information," thank you, "about where their husbands are. And that's the information you should take back, because Madame Allende, Hortensia, is going to the UN in 3 weeks, and we want her to have all the information about where the political prisoners are so it can be presented to the UN and they can help get them out." And of course I thought Amnesty will help them get them out too. So we had many adventures in Chile, and only when we went to Valparaiso, a little resort there, for the day, because we'd been with the religious underground who were copying all the stuff for us, and we had met with all the wives in their disguises in the pool and threw the red ball back and forth, and they would tell me, and then Susanna, who spoke wonderful Spanish, which I did not, they would give us all the information. And we couldn't write anything down, so we kept that in our heads. And somehow or other we got out. It was quite an adventure. And I was met at the airport by Teddy Kennedy's minion, who said, "Come instantly with me to Washington," because Teddy knew I was we worked together a lot over the years, and he knew I was in Chile. And so in my old travel clothes I'd had on for 3 days, because we couldn't get out of the country easily, and our bags had gone on without us. I went to Washington, and Teddy came out of this building to meet me in his tux, looking terrific, and said, "Okay, come on in with me. I want you to tell me everything, but we can talk tomorrow in my office." And I said, but I looked around, and everybody was in formal clothes. And he said, "This is a welcome party for Henry Kissinger." And I said, I'm not coming with you to meet Henry Kissinger, because I had learned in Valparaiso that the tall ships, which have come a couple times to the USA and are beautiful, harbored a number of Allende's ministers as political prisoners, and behind the beautiful tall ships was the American Navy. And that's when I learned from somebody we met there that Henry Kissinger had ordered them there to protect. So I didn't want to meet Henry Kissinger, but Teddy grabbed my arm and took me across to a place where Henry was coming through a door and up a slanted walkway into the room. And there were lots of photographers, and everybody was greeting Henry and shaking his hand, and we were sort of up at the top of the ramp. And he got to me, and I refused to shake his hand, and the photographers caught it. They loved that. And Henry did not love that. And I have to say, he pursued me off and on for decades after that, trying to make a friend of me, which didn't work. But
He does show, kind of comical how often you run into him in your life, and he's always trying to schmooze you, and it doesn't get anywhere. But he keeps popping up in the unlikely, in an airport somewhere, and there's Henry hanging out waiting for the same plane, and he does pop up a lot.
I used to get into trouble because I lived on Martha's Vineyard in the summer, and Catherine Graham of the Washington Post had bought a house there, and Henry came to visit her every summer, and she always asked me and Bill to come to dinner, or asked me to come play tennis or whatever, and I would say, Kay, I'm not going to come when Henry Kissinger's there. But she foxed me twice, so that was...
What does that mean, she foxed me? She tricked you?
She tricked me.
And she got you to show up?
And I got there twice when Henry was there.
Ugh.
I wrote about all that.
Yes,
I'm not
you
going to
did.
talk
Yes,
about it.
Well, the one, thing about your book is that there's really no gossip in it. That is, you don't really tell tales out of school. You tell a lot of stories, but you don't really seem to have any scores to settle with people. The only person you don't seem to care for is Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
That everybody else became your friend.
Well...
And why would you tell stories about your friends?
Exactly.
I think that's kind of...
Yeah. I'm just lucky. I had a lot of friends.
You have, well... I
If
know
you live
that
long
perhaps because
enough,
you don't
you've got a
gossip
lot of
about it.
friends.
But I think I seem to recall when this book was going through various mutations and editors and published that word would come to you, oh, can't you be bitchy about anybody? And you just declined to do that.
Well,
What's the point, kind of?
what's the point?
Yeah, it seemed to be, now, speaking as a writer, you that is, was there one overriding reason for writing the book? Or do you think it would be a lark? Or had you been thinking about it for years? Or I feel like somebody came to you and asked you to do this.
Yes. An editor who I met on my porch with another editor who was a friend called me and said, I'd like to give you a contract to write a memoir. And I said, oh, no, I never look back. I only look forward. Well, about a year or so after that, it was COVID, and I had moved to the vineyard, and I was there by myself, and she called again. And I said, well, okay, I don't have anything better to do. So for like 2.5 years,
You worked on
I
it.
sat, and I had one of Bill Styron's old yellow pads. We still had lots of those, and I'm a lefty, and I write everything longhand with a pen. I don't type. And so I just scribbled. And the book that's there, here, is the result of my scribbling. My editor cut a lot of things out because it was too long. I made her put one chapter back in that she cut out where Kurt Vonnegut and I went to Eastern Europe for Penn to find the underground writers. And Bill, who had published Sophie's Choice a year or two before, I've forgotten how long, said, well, I'll take you to Auschwitz. If you're going to Poland, you should really see it. So that's how the chapter began, and then it proceeded with our other trips. And she just cut it out because she wasn't interested.
It's a good, it's
But
a
I made her
really
put,
good
well,
story.
I cut it down,
Yeah.
2/3, so you don't have all the names of the or adventures with the wonderful writers, but you do have.
And that trip, wasn't that a trip where Bill ended up going home? And you went home too. I
Oh,
thought that was the Russia trip where he said,
that was a Russia trip.
not the same trip?
No, Bill
Okay,
went to Paris,
sorry.
where he usually went after he took Kurt and me to Auschwitz. No, it was when we went to Russia. Bill didn't like to travel to places he didn't know and not have absolute control of what was going on. But it was 1968 when all of us woke up, grew up, went and became activists after Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed. And we were invited to an Afro-Asian writers' conference in Moscow and Tashkent. And we got on a plane actually in Istanbul because Bill was presenting The Confessions of Nat Turner, which he had just written, at a big conference in Istanbul. And we got on the plane to go to Moscow, which we'd agreed to do, and read as we got on the plane that Russia had just invaded Czechoslovakia. So we didn't want to go at all. But there we were, and our bags were there. We couldn't get off at that moment. So we went to Moscow, and Russian writers, whose names you'd probably know, met us. And somehow Bill persuaded a couple of them to complain to their government about the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And we only had like a day and a half in Moscow. They wanted to get rid of us and not hear us, so they sent us all to Tashkent. And we had a marvelous time, not under surveillance, in Tashkent, walking around to the melon markets and the wonderful singing and birthdays of writers. It was a big writers' town. And I met probably 25 writers from different countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia who couldn't publish in their own countries. It turned out that this was a writers' conference for activists from all the other countries. We were the only Westerners there, the only Americans, and we were not supposed to be presenting. We were supposed to be auditing, listening, etc. And they thought Bill was a good revolutionary because he'd written about Nat Turner. And that's the last thing Bill Styron was. So he was a big disappointment to them and got us into trouble, but that was fine. And I met all these extraordinary writers whose languages I couldn't handle. They all spoke English, which was very interesting. But they piled their manuscripts on me to take back to the USA. and get published. So I dumped them all at Yale and said, please do what you can with these. And I went down to the State Department thinking I would be able to tell them about what was going on with all the human rights problems in all these countries. And they patted me on the head and said, nice lady, go home. And I went back to Connecticut wondering what I was going to do with all of it. And Philip Roth had become a neighbor, and his girlfriend, Barbara Sproul, whom you all may know, she lives in New York and still teaches here, said, I know what you can do with it. You can come with me. We're starting the first USA group of Amnesty International, still run from London, but we're getting it together here. And so I went to New York and joined this first group of Amnesty and stuck with it for most of the rest of my life.
On the Upper West Side.
Certainly didn't write another poem for 20 years.
Was there a part or parts, excuse me, of your book that were harder to write than others? I know you've talked about it was really fun to sit there and have these childhood memories come back to you. Were there other parts that were more challenging or just more fraught that were difficult to write? Was it difficult to write about Bill's depressions? Was that, or did that come easily? Had you, or was that
I hadn't
painful?
thought of that. I scribbled whatever came into my head about all my adventures on several continents for Amnesty and with Bill and the children and
Right.
the guys that I traveled around with, like Robert Brustein, all died in the last month. But we would go on nice trips with our
Right.
children to the Caribbean, but mainly I was on Amnesty trips everywhere.
Right.
And what was the question?
Well, I was wondered whether it was hard to sit and write about Bill's
about his
Bill's
depression.
depression. Was that?
Yes.
I mean, that must have been
That
hard
was
to
the
go
rest
back
of
there
it
and
came
revisit
easy.
it. Yeah.
This was hard because it was such an emotional challenge for both of us. And there were so many bad turns of event. And being Pollyanna, I don't like writing about things that are that bad. But it was very good that I tried to do it. And what I hope I showed, not only all the problems and difficulties that people with sudden, terrible depressions, and Bill had 15 years apart, what they go through. But what I wanted to show was that after Bill wrote his book, Darkness Visible, about his depression, which is still being used by psychiatrists everywhere, I gather, for people who have depression now. I think what saved him, or one of the things that saved him in the 15 years between the two, was all the people who would call him or come to see him and say, your book really helped me. I didn't know what it was like, but I was able to do this or that because I read your book. And that was just amazing for Bill and made him, feel pretty good. And once I remember, because he was very quiet and had to be alone, and the kids had to be quiet. And anyway, we won't go into that. But I used to hear him pick up the phone and almost whisper. And so I'd go away, and I thought, oh my God, he's talking to some woman, and I better not know if he's having an affair with somebody or what.
Right.
And then once I picked up the phone, and he was talking to a woman, No, this time I picked it up more than once, but the first time I picked it up, I heard him talking to a policeman, and the policeman said, "Mr. Styron, we have a man here who is outside the window of this high apartment, and he wants to jump off. And we're trying to persuade him not to. We're not grabbing him and saying, 'Come back. Could you please talk to him? Because we know from his wife that he's in a terrible depression and he wants to commit suicide.'" So Bill said, "Okay, I'll talk to him." And the policeman gave the guy the phone or held it for him, and Bill talked him out of jumping off and
That's not
saved
in the
his
book.
life. And that
That's
made
wonderful. Yeah.
things. Bill felt that he was really pretty useful.
Yes, he was,
But then after the second depression, he felt he had failed everybody because he had written Darkness Visible, which has a lovely positive ending about how things are now going to be okay once you're over all this. And he felt he'd let them all his readers down because here he was
ugh,
again. But anyway,
painful. You said something in the recent. James Lapine directed a wonderful documentary about Rose. That's out, rentable or streamable. You said you wished you had let Bill talk to you a little. He seemed to want to unburden himself of all his guilts and feelings that he hadn't done right by you and the kids. And you said, I wish I'd let him talk instead of saying, "Oh, never mind, never mind, never mind."
well, I
And I found that very
I
moving.
couldn't face it, and I couldn't go back at that moment. I thought I wasn't
Yeah.
good enough to go back to all the times he had shut up or dissed the children,
Right.
or that he had cut me out of
Right.
things that. Anyway, we won't go into
All
it.
right.
But I kept saying, no, everything's just fine, Bill, because I couldn't go back into it myself, and I regretted that a lot.
Colleen, how we doing? Okay. Oh gosh, we guys should wind it up. This is not so much a question, but I do love this quote. I don't remember if it's from the movie or from the book, but somebody asked you, "Oh, gee, what do you do when your friends pass away?" And so many people passed away, and
I was going to say 4 guys that I was close
Oh.
to. I've lost in the last month, but that's what happens when you're my age.
Well, you did have a wonderful response, which was, whoever asked you this question said, "What do you do?" And you said, "Make younger friends."
Absolutely.
Which I did love.
I'm really lucky. I have lots of younger friends.
Yes, you do. And I thought before, I know we have to do Q&A, but I just want to ask Rose, if you would, it's not a long poem, if you would just read us this beautiful poem that you wrote, because you did return to writing poetry, and this was a published poem. It's called "Good Night, Great Summer Sky." Oh, thank you, Sarah.
The only reason she's asked me to read it, it's the title poem. The last line is the title, which is "Beyond This Harbor."
Also, well,
That's
because it's
why
a beautiful
it's
poem.
included, even though my editor said, this is not a book of poetry, I'm not going to include it. And by God, she did.
And it's right up front,
Yes, it's right
which
up
I
front.
love. Okay.
Good night, great summer sky, world of my childhood and the star-struck sea. White chaise from that ancestral southern porch, my raft. White goose down quilt, my ballast. Under Orion on the green waved lawn, I float high. New moon, old craft, tide strong as ever to the sea. over the seawall, on the dock, Andromeda, their strict and jeweled guard, as tall Orion seas and lawns ago chose to be mine. Our children sleep, Alexandra, Tom, under their folded goose-wing sails, true friends in dream, the folly wrangling of their sibling day, outshone by starlight, calm island evening, never-ending sea. Our lovers' rages, too, are quiet, drowned. Miracle of midsummer, the trust of dark, sails us beyond this harbor. Praises. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you for reading. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have time for Q&A? Do we?
If it works for you.
Of course.
Great. Who'd like to ask a question?
You'll have to raise your hands to Jenny because I can't see.
You can hear them.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, I don't know if it's on, can you hear me? I'm curious about when you write a memoir about how you remember the details. In other words, did you keep a diary or was it just attempted to remember all the things that you've done, a lot of things in your life? How does someone do that?
Yes, did you keep a diary? How did you remember details?
I never kept a diary. I never kept journals, except when I went on wildlife trips with Peter Matheson.
The Rose is a
Because
great
I forgot
birder.
the birds'
Yeah.
names, but that's the only.
So you basically just
I kept
recalled,
a
you
journal.
recalled all the.
And who knows what piece of my brain pulled it up when I had no friends around and it was totally quiet, and somehow
I don't
it all
know.
reappeared.
Some of the Amnesty trips, a couple of them you wrote about in the New York Review and Mother Jones. So I have a feeling
Oh, yeah, I agree.
You were able
I
to-
wrote for Ms. and Mother Jones.
you were able to look at
and
some
a
of
lot
those, I think.
newspapers. And so, of course, I had those to refer to.
But you have a pretty good memory.
Well, I guess so.
Yeah.
I
You
mean,
do. I think you do.
there were a lot of details from childhood and from, trips to Vietnam and Cambodia and Chile and other places that just came up in my head. And I think it was because for all my Amnesty trips, I was never allowed to make notes, or that if I made them, I had to rip them up and flush them down the toilet in lots of different countries. And so they stuck in my head, I guess.
I guess
That's
so.
all I can think of.
At what point did you start writing poetry again?
When?
When did you
At
start?
what point? What was the catalyst to you restarting?
When I started to write?
No, to
Restarted
restart.
What?
After, when you didn't write poetry for, sorry,
For 20
Tony.
years. Oh, what?
Then what made you start writing it again?
Because a poet, Galway Cannell, who was my good friend, I was talking to on the vineyard. You can see that this poem was from the vineyard. And he had come up one summer, and I said, I was just offered a job with the UN, but I don't think, I'm not sure I want to take it. It sounds a little boring to me, even though I had to go and talk there from time to time. And I said it was going to make me go to Geneva and this and that. He said, well, before you decide, why don't you come with me out to a writers' conference in the West, and come for 2 weeks. And if you want to get back to poetry, why don't you just come and see what you think? So I went for 2 weeks, and I had wonderful teachers like Robert Haas and Sharon Olds and Galway and so forth. And it got me right back to poetry. I never thought of going to the UN or doing anything else again. So I started to write, and I guess it was, 2 years later that I then published a
With this
book
fierce
by,
day?
by Vineyard Light.
By Vineyard Light,
It was a book, and it was illustrated, and George Plimpton made me go to Rizzoli and with a young photographer who I'd done some work on the vineyard with. He was actually my children's tennis coach, but a fabulous photographer. And Rizzoli published the book, and so I got into it. And that was in the 90s, and I've done a couple since then, a couple of books since then.
I have a question. Can you hear me? In terms of Amnesty,
a little louder, baby.
You might have to translate.
speak
My
like
pa-
if it was an
I
ice cream
forgot my
cone.
hearing aids.
Like that.
I'm really
In terms of
sorry if I don't
Amnesty
hear you
International,
properly.
was there a particular event that you were so proud of that you've accomplished?
Regarding Amnesty, I'm so glad you asked that, because I was gonna ask that and we ran out of time. What, regarding Amnesty, was there a particular event that you were most proud of accomplishing? A particular, it's hard because you were with them for a long time, but she asks, was
That I
there
wanted to
No,
accomplish.
no,
That you
you
did
were most,
accomplish.
that you were most,
That I
that you're most proud of?
I hadn't thought about that, but I think if there was anything effective, it was helping Teddy Kennedy start all the Kennedy. Sorry, thanks. The Kennedy Memorial events in which they are still favoring human rights.
Maybe one more question or so, correct?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask you, I mean, certainly the work for Amnesty International is very different from writing poetry. So once you restarted writing poetry, were the subjects of your poetry influenced by your work for Amnesty? In other words, did your poetry become somewhat more, let's
You mean
say?
by the time I got back to writing?
Yes.
I think it's buried in there in many ways, but not, I mean,
Must be right.
I refer to it, it is buried in there. There's not a poem that's exclusively about human rights. They're still separate but interwoven.
Yes, thank you.
She has a question.
You're so interesting. So my question is, in everything that you've done, and it's really an extraordinary life, it's really a very extraordinary life. What are your words of wisdom for us to lead an extraordinary life as well? What would you suggest in these times?
Well, you want to just translate it up.
What are your words of wisdom? Do you have any parting words?
Thank you.
What is
for
your-
you're
what is
saying,
your
but I'm not
thought-
sure what the question is.
The question is, what would your words of wisdom be, or counsel or advice on how to lead an extraordinary life?
Live in the moment. Take every opportunity that you have to go out into the world or into the next bedroom or into your children's questioning minds, and just deal with it in the moment, and don't sit and reflect about the past unless somebody asks you to write a memoir.
So it's don't live in your head, live out here in the world.
Yes, she says, it's don't live in your head, live out in the world, she said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking.